If they said something interesting, like the most important thing for us is X, I'd write that down and I'd write who said it. And later on, when I'm doing my sales demo, I will have seen that circled note or I've recreated it onto my notepad and I will use it. I will say, oh, Raj, remember when you told me that the number one most important thing was efficiency? Well, can you see how what we just looked at creates an incredibly efficient environment for you? Oh, yes, absolutely. Now you have buy-in from the whole room that you've met their number one most important need.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Raj Khera, the host of the morebusiness.com podcast, and I am welcoming today Matt Melnick. He is a colleague of mine from one of our prior companies that we were both on the executive team together. It was about a 200-person company called Wealth Engine. I was running marketing, Matt was running sales, and today's topic is the perfect discovery call. Matt, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Raj, it's like to be here. Glad to reconnect with you and always love chatting with you.
Yeah, and Matt and I learned a lot from each other during that that time that we had with our prior company. And today's topic is the perfect discovery call. This is a topic I think that just about every business really can get their hands around because everybody has to sell. Whether you like it or not, you have to sell to grow your company.
Sure.
And what we're going to do today is just walk through the entire process and listen to the end because you'll see how the different steps connect together and then unfold so that you get a commitment from your prospect at the end. So, Matt, let's start talking about the first step, and I'm going to call it step 0 because you need to do this before you even get started. Is who do you call? Who should actually do the call on your team?
Great question. I love that you started with this because I think it's really important. The reason is I actually think the discovery call is the single most important part of the sales process. It's where you set the foundation. It's where you make them form an opinion of you. It's where you get information from them that you should then be using throughout the process. So, because of that, I am always baffled when I hear business development reps doing discovery calls, BDRs or SDRs. I actually think the discovery call is so important that your most talented person should be doing it because it's where you set the table. So I would always have a well qualified sales rep do it. I would not have, your entry level to sales person. They typically, or they simply just don't have the skill set to ask the depth of questions that needs to, be determined.
Now, in a moment, we're going to get into how to start the call, what to say during the call, and how to get these little wins along the way. But before you actually pick up the phone and dial those numbers, you've got to do something. That's really step 0, right? It's once you know who's going to
True.
do the call, unless you're senior person. What is that step 0 in terms of preparation and so on?
So it's interesting. When I was running a Salesforce, large Salesforce at a company, Vocus, a couple of my reps were doing great research prior to the calls, and they actually named it pre-call prep. So I think doing pre-call prep is something that everyone should do. It doesn't have to take a tremendously, long amount of time, but it's really important. I'm going to share real quickly a couple of things to do for pre-call prep, but also why it's important. So, what I would do is simply Google the company, read recent news, try to understand things like their strategic initiatives. You don't want to go into a call. You've actually always laughed at this. I know you hate when salespeople come into the room and say, don't you want to grow your revenue? Well, of course, people want to grow their revenue, but you need to find strategic initiatives that are a little bit more specific. So you
It's
can
the most
Google.
cliche comment, right? Like there's someone who goes in and they say the
Yeah,
most cliche thing that every senior executive has heard 100 times, and that's why they stop taking calls is because
yeah,
they're spoiled, right? They just don't want to hear that
ex-
anymore.
exactly. So I would Google strategic initiatives, Microsoft, if you're meeting with Microsoft, or CEO strategic initiatives, Microsoft, and see what comes up. Look at earnings calls. Go do a quick LinkedIn check on the person you're meeting with. See if they've worked at any company that's used you in the past. See if they're connected to people. All of these things are important. And obviously, there's more things that you can do. That could be a topic, a class all on its own. But the reason you want to do this is you want to try to elevate the call. You want to try to start the call, and have a point of view already and make it a little bit more strategic. So if you can come in and say, hey, this is what I've read about you all, these are your strategic initiatives. This is how you make money. This is how you save money. So those things align with the drivers that get people to buy your product. So if you could elevate
Yeah.
the conversation and start, at 20 miles an hour instead of at 0 miles an hour, that's much better and you'll have a more structured, strategic, interesting call. So I
Okay.
think call prep is very important.
Very important. I think a lot of people would definitely insist that you do some of that pre-call prep, and it doesn't have to take a long time, right? It can just be even
Yeah,
like five minutes, maybe 10 minutes at the very most, just to
definitely.
get a sense of where that company stands, where that executive stands. All right, so now we're at the time. We're going to pick up the phone. We're going to dial those numbers, and we're going to reach out. And let's presume we've made that connection, and the person on the other side of the phone picks up. What is step one? What do you say?
Well, first of all, before we get started, I want to make a distinction here. There's all sorts of discovery calls. There's discovery calls that could roll into to demos. For this discussion, let's assume that the discovery call and demo are separate entities. So we're going to do a discovery call today, and hopefully, should all go
Okay.
well. If there's a love connection, we're going to move to a demo at another point. So let's just make that
Mhm.
as the
Good
variable for
distinction.
today. Yeah.
Good
So
distinction. Okay.
and there's a variety of ways that you can start. Um, I'm a big fan of getting some quick introductions. Now, quick is the key word here. Quick meaning you don't want introductions to take 20% of your time or 10% of your time. So the art here, the skill here is if you have a lot of people, you don't go around the room and get each person you don't introduce each person and have them, or you don't let each person introduce themselves, excuse me. You have the key person introduce everyone and give a quick role. What's their role? So that you understand the players that you have in the room. And you might do the same if you have a number of people on your team. But it's really nice to get an understanding of what each person does, because then you know who to speak to when you're talking about different components of your product or service. So that's
And
the
that's
first
really
thing I would do.
important. Yeah, that's important because, like, if you go around the room and everybody takes a minute and there's 7 people, in a 30-minute call, you're already probably 7 to 10 minutes in, and you haven't even started the call. You're just still introducing people,
Yep.
right?
By the
So I
way,
like that
if
approach.
you're sorry for interrupting. If you are in an actual room and you're around a table, I would write down, because taking notes is important, and we'll get to that in a minute. But I would potentially
Mhm.
write down, almost in a seating chart fashion, who's who and what their role is, because it's great to talk to people directly. So it's not just to be pleasant and polite. There's a rhyme and reason behind why you do, a quick role understanding. So just a tidbit, a
And
tip
I
there.
would even do that. Yeah, I would do that on a Zoom call also.
Yeah.
Always write down who you're talking to because sometimes it's not popping up on the screen. You get their name, and you just you can even look them up afterwards on LinkedIn as you go forward. Okay, so now you've got that introduction. What's the next step?
So after a quick roll, really, really like to get an understanding of where we are in the buyer's journey, as they call it. And the easiest way to do that is simply ask the people, what led you to take this call? Now we're going to go into the strategic initiatives and have a deeper discussion in a minute, but just, step one, what led you to take this call? That tells me where we are. It's a whole different conversation if they tell me that they took the call because they took a cold call, it sounded interesting, and they wanted to hear what we had. That's a totally different call than, oh, we're using a competitor today, my boss asked me to meet with you all because the competitor doesn't do certain things. Well, I'm going to speak totally differently to them. In scenario one, I'm going to have to educate them much more. In scenario two, I'm going to have to drive home the differences, understand what it is that they're missing, and make sure that they feel like we can tackle that and accomplish it. So they're two very different calls because I'm entering at different points. So it's a very simple
Yeah.
question that gives you a lot of insight into how you're going to approach.
And that's a really important point too, because you don't know, you might think you know going into it. And I've seen so many people pick up the phone and they just start going into a pitch. They think the discovery call is almost a pitch, and you don't really know where the prospect is in the journey, as you'd mentioned. So I love that. What prompted you to take this call? Led you to take this call? Great way to open right after you do the introductions. So now that's step one. So let's go. Step two. What's the next step after you ask that question and you can figure out which direction you're going to be starting with your line of questions.
Yep, super important here, and it's something that sounds very routine and basic and almost silly, but super important. I'm going to explain why, because there's two things that need to be done here. It's rolling out an agenda. And by the way, you could do the agenda before intros. It's up to you when you do it, but it needs to be done, in the first few minutes. But rolling out an agenda is incredibly important for a couple of reasons. Number one, it lets them know that this is a business discussion. You're not here to just show them product and, intro them to the market. This is a business discussion. You're a professional.
Mhm.
You have a plan, a structure, and oh, by the way, you are in control. You are the boss here. Like, you are running the show. So that's the first reason why it's important. The second reason why it's important, and by the way, the agenda should take 30 seconds, 45 seconds maybe. This is not a long, drawn out thing. But there are two things that I really want to do in laying out the agenda. Number one, well, there's three things. I'm sorry. Number one, I want them to be prepared to know that I'm going to ask them a bunch of questions. So I'm going to share that with them in the agenda, that I'm going to ask questions to learn about their business, to try to understand if there's a fit. But these two things are really key, and they're very rarely done. And let me explain what they are. And by the way, you do not have to be a good salesperson to do these two things. And everyone should be doing them because they're easy. Number one, you have to do a time check during the agenda. And a time check means if we have 30 minutes for a call, okay, you need to know what happens at minute 31. Is that person off to another meeting? Do they have any flexibility? And the reason you need to know that is because the number one worst way to end a sales call, and I'm sure you've seen this, dozens of times, and I know it makes me cringe, is having the person at the 30-minute mark or whatever time is say, "Oh no, I got to go. My boss is on another call for me and I can't, they don't have 5 seconds to set up a next step or share insight or feedback because they got a call with their boss or they're leading a team call or something." And it ends in like,
Mhm.
never, never land. It's in the ether now. We're in thin air. So the purpose behind the time check is to make sure that you know when you have to stop it. What's the 5 minute mark that you need to stop so that you can have sort of the next step discussion. And if you're not done with your discovery call or your demo, you have to be done because you have to leave. And this is the second most important part. And you need to tell them this, that you need to leave 5 minutes at the end of the call so you can recap. And recap means we're probably going to talk about price a little bit because you want to start to litmus test them. Okay. You want to start to see the whites of their eyes when you talk about price. Are they thinking grapes and you're thinking oranges? Okay. Number one. Number two, you want to validate that what they saw was beneficial to them. You want to get them to admit that. Number three, you want to agree to a next step. Maybe it's a demo. If so, can you expand the audience? Can you get the boss or decision maker there? And number four, absolutely positively most important, if you don't do anything else, you must do this. And if you don't, it's a fail, like a big F. And that is you have to set a calendared next step. I don't care if it's something as simple as you need to chat with some people. Go do that. What do you need? A couple days? Great. Today's Tuesday. Why don't I call you on Thursday? How's 10 a.m. for 5 minutes for us to check in? And you have to get on the calendar. Okay. Even if the person says, "Oh, well, let me check with my people and I'll get back with you," put it on the calendar simply as a check in with them. And the way to do that is by saying, "Hey, look, we're both busy. So we're not chasing each other. Let's just put 5 minutes." And 90% of the time they say yes. And now you have a next step. You're not chasing the person forever. So that's why you have to set an agenda because you have to do those two things: time check, stop at the 5 minute mark, calendar next step. Super important.
So now we've got a handful of steps in the process. So just to do a quick recap, as we're part of the way through this discussion, first thing is you make sure that the senior person is calling. You do the prep work. You start the conversation in the hello, how are you, small talk stuff, and then you transition into the question, what led you to take this call? You set the agenda. Verify that there is enough time for them at the end so that you don't run over and that you can start talking about the business aspects of the entire dialogue. Okay, so now we've done the agenda, we've done the time check. What happens next?
So I would right now, depending on the pre-call prep that you had, and by the way, you could probably do this, after you've asked, why'd you take this meeting? I would go back to the strategic initiatives that you uncovered, and I would walk them through what you've learned and ask them if there's merit to that, if they agree with that. Ask them how that relates to their specific piece of the business. So I would have that little business discussion right then and there. It's a great way to show that you're intelligent. It's a great way to show that you've done some research, and it just is a great way to have a conversation instead of starting at zero. You're sort of laying things out and getting them to validate, meaning they don't have to do all the thinking. So I would
Mhm.
have that. And again, one thing I want to note is I believe in a flow. I believe that everyone should have a flow so that you don't forget things. These parts that I'm talking about now are somewhat interchangeable. Like again, you could start with an agenda, jump into roles, jump into what led you to this, meeting, and then jump into the strategic initiatives that you've learned. You don't have to do it in the order I'm talking about, but you need to do it in an order that you get comfortable in so you don't forget things and becomes repeatable.
Yeah. This is good. This is good. So now you still haven't talked a lot about yourself. I love that so far we're actually still getting them. I mean, we're setting the agenda and everything, but we're getting them to start verifying that these are indeed the initiatives that are important to them. Because if you start doing a pitch and you're only talking about stuff that's important to you as a salesperson, it's going to fall on deaf ears because they're like, oh, this person doesn't understand me. They don't understand my problems. But if you open with this information, like, hey, here's what I know about your initiatives and verify that this is in fact the truth and something that's important to them, that's really critical. That's really critical.
Yep.
So then what happens? What happens after that part of the conversation?
So I want to clarify one thing. You're 100% right. We've not done a ton of talking about ourselves here. We've done some talking. We've demonstrated that we work, and we did research. That said, I would make sure that you really limit the time you spend talking about their strategic initiatives to a couple minutes. Now, if they open up and start taking you all sorts of ways, grab the info and go. But sometimes people get frustrated. Like they're here to learn about what you're offering. So sometimes when you sit here and do too much deep diving on their business without relating it back to the product, I've seen people get frustrated. So I would make sure that that's something that's done succinctly. So after you
Mhm.
do that, now it's time to start talking about us. Before we start asking them specific questions about their needs, because the strategic initiatives are more about their business overall. When we start to ask questions, we're going to really talk how it relates to our product or service. But before you do that, I believe wholeheartedly that it is very important before you start just asking questions. I believe that it is very important to give a succinct, clear, what I like to refer to as pretend like you're talking to your Aunt Betty pitch. And what that means is speak English, make it understandable. Don't make the prospect have to try to figure out what it is you do or why it's valuable. And I see so many pitches where people speak to me and I literally don't understand what the product does. One time someone told me they have uh, a revenue velocity acceleration platform. I'm like, literally, I have no idea what that means. Like, please,
Mm.
spare me the techno and just get right into it. So I believe that you need a really simple.
Just on that, you know what I think what happens is that there's some people that are like, well, this market could use our service, this market could use our service, that market could also use our products and service. And what they're trying to do is figure out one phrase that encapsulates every single market. And what happens? Nobody understands what they're talking about because it's
Yeah,
so vague, so generic that you've lost them. You've completely lost them. And that's one of the biggest mistakes I see marketers make is that they try to come up with these words that just become mumbo jumbo. And really,
yep,
if you can take the words you're using to pitch your product, take your product out of it and apply it to any other product, not even in your industry. And if they're that interchangeable, that means you've got gobbledygook for messaging and you've got to rework that. So that's not the topic of this podcast, but that is something that you should be aware of. That if you're being asked to pitch gobbledygook, push back a little bit and lean in and get some better word choice. so,
well, to your point, I have a
yeah.
simple formula that people can follow when trying to come up with your succinct and Betty like pitch. And by the way, remember, you need to give this succinct pitch so they understand what you do. So when they're answering your questions, they're answering them in the correct context. Okay. So the formula is problem solving, the problem we're solving, the solution to that problem, and why it matters, the benefit. So problem, solution, benefit. I think it's great to start with, let me tell you the problem we're solving. Okay. You're starting to set a very easy foundation. Number one. Number two, you'll start to see if they shake their head, if they have that problem, like, oh yeah, I get that. Like, I understand that. And the problem, simply, how do we solve it? And then why does it matter? Why do we need to solve that problem? What do we get from solving that problem? So
Mhm, mhm. And
that's
you
the
can even
formula to
toss in a
follow.
couple of yeah, you can even toss in a couple of, points like and we've seen our client save $25,000 their first month using something like this or whatever the key benefit is. But
Absolutely.
the benefit should the more metric driven your benefit, the easier it is for people to understand because they'll know. They'll get it. You know, you can talk
And
about
I
productivity gains, you
would
can talk about
practice.
money. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. You're
Yep,
100%
yep,
correct. And I love the idea of throwing
yep.
in client, success metrics. But I would make sure
Yeah.
to practice the pitch, and I practice it in front of people that aren't necessarily in the space you're selling to. And if they can understand the problem, the solution, and the benefit and why it matters, then you've done the pitch correctly.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good. Matt, I'm going to just keep going down our steps here. So we've
Sure.
got, the step 2, the agenda. We've got step 4, verifying the strategic initiatives. Sorry, that was step 3. Step 4 is your maybe 2-minute pitch where you describe the problem, the solution that you're solving for, and the benefit that people would get because of that. So now what's that next step? What would be a step 5?
Yeah, I want to make a note as you were reading those off, something I was thinking about popped into my head, which is the first several steps, if you notice, don't involve any selling skills. So you don't have to
Mm-hmm.
be a great salesperson to nail the first several steps. Like, you, everyone should do that, regardless of how good of a sales rep you are. Everyone should do a time check, leave time at the end for a business discussion, set a calendar next step, go over roles. Everyone should do that. And then what's next is the selling skills. Like, giving a good pitch, an Aunt Betty like pitch, is a selling skill, and you can practice that, and you should practice it. And so here's where I think the real selling skills come in. It's when you flip the table and you start to try to figure out how your product or service will benefit them, and you try to get them to see why they need it. It's when you start to ask questions, and you're I think a lot of people have a misconception of why you ask questions. Okay, you're not actually asking questions to get knowledge. I mean, yes, you are, but the primary reason that you're asking questions is you're getting them to admit to you that they have a problem that you can solve. You're trying to get the prospect to use your language, to restate your value drivers and benefit statements. So you you have to be very skilled at asking questions. You have to probe, and you have to dig, and you have to do things like take notes. Okay, it's super important to take notes, especially if you have a number of people in the room and you have to put, my system for taking notes was, if they said something interesting, like, the most important thing for us is X. I'd write that down, and I'd write who said it. And later on, when I'm doing my selling, my sales demo, notice how I didn't say my product tutorial because it is a sales demo. When I'm doing my sales demo, I will have seen that I circled that note, or I've recreated it onto my new notepad or whatever it may be, and I will use it. I will say, "Oh, Raj, remember when you told me that the number one most important thing was efficiency? Well, can you see how what we just looked at creates an incredibly efficient environment for you?" Oh, yes, absolutely. Now you have buy in from the whole room that you've met their number one most important need.
Matt,
So
I love
take,
what you said. I want to pause. I'm going to pause. Here's why I want to pause because what
go.
you said was a mini close. And I hear a lot of people saying, how do I close? I need closers. I want to close the deal. And what you're really doing is you're getting buy-in all along the journey. I mean, it really starts with, is this the good agenda? Is this the right agenda? Can we stop at this time? Can we? Those are many, many, many buy-ins, many yeses, yeses. And then now, as you just described, you have them, you ask leading questions to have them bring about their problem and then connect the dots That's what you
Yeah.
did there. You see how what we just saw can connect those dots? That's a big, big step. I think one of the
Yep.
challenges I really encounter with people is when you try to train them to ask leading questions, one of the most ridiculous question, and we touched on this is, well, so, is saving money, is making more money a priority for your business during this quarter? I mean, don't ask a stupid leading question,
Yeah,
right?
terrible.
That there's
But
nothing that's going to
it's
make you lose
thoughtless,
credibility faster. Yeah, it's lazy. It makes you come across
lazy,
looking bad, makes
even
your
better.
company. Yeah, yeah. So I think it's really important though connecting those dots. I love that. And so to just recap step 6, which is a really critical step here, or step 5, I should say, and that is to dig to get layers of information using leading questions because you want to align the problem that you're solving for with the product or service that you have so that you can connect those dots. Is there more to it?
Yeah, I think that these, some of the steps that you may have are going to be sort of commingled together because it's all about the art
Mhm,
of asking questions
mhm,
and then using that information. So to continue in that path, you know, we talked about. I want to give an example actually of what I mean when I say depth of questions. Bad sales reps. Let's pretend that we're selling a CRM like Salesforce. Everyone knows what a CRM is, right? I don't really need to explain it. Everyone on this that's listening to this probably uses one. So let's pretend that we're selling someone a CRM. And obviously, saving time is a benefit of a CRM. Okay. I mean, there's lots of them, but let's just go with the really easy one. So, a bad sales rep or an inexperienced sales rep might actually say to the person, "Oh, tell me how you manage your customer information today." And they might answer it. And then the sales rep will go on and continue with their discussion. Well, I want you to take that answer, listen to what they're saying. I need you to lead the horse to water, right? I need you to get them to admit that they have a problem. So don't just let them tell you how they do it. Take the information you hear. Oh, we use Excel, we write down stuff and keep an Excel spreadsheet. Okay, well, the next question should be, oh, well, isn't that very time consuming? Isn't it hard to find or hard to search? Or how do you keep track of emails? Or, whatever the questions are that you need to get them to admit, you have to ask that question.
mhm,
Like, is
mhm,
that very time consuming? Well, yeah. Actually, I didn't hear you talk about this. Well, no, we don't do that because it takes too much time. Great. If you could do that, what would that do to your business? Oh, it would probably increase our renewal rates. Great.
mhm,
Let's talk about that. If you could increase your renewal rates by 5%, what does that do to your business? Now you've had ROI, you have meaning, you have need on their part, and you have a really easy business case for them to go in. But you have to dig and ask the questions where you know what the answers are. You know what you want to get them to admit. You just have to go be the trial attorney and get them to admit what you want them to say.
mhm. Yep, that's a good, and I like bringing prior points of the conversation. Like, hey, you said earlier X, Y, Z. So if we could actually solve for something like that, if we could do this, would that be useful to you? And I remember one time there's a salesperson I know. He shared this story with me. He was in a meeting with top executives from a company. I think that it was a very expensive meeting to have because you've got a VP of this, VP of that, all in the same room, and they were talking about logistics for delivering products to their retail stores. And so one of the problems that came about was sometimes the truck would go to the wrong store. And then what happens? You've got all these extra products at this one store. So he thought, oh, this is cool. I figured out a problem. I can solve all their logistics stuff. And he came back with this big proposal to solve all this, and they didn't accept it. He was like, well, why didn't they accept? They had that problem. So what he didn't ask was, if we could solve for this, would this be useful? Because if he had asked that question, they would have said, actually, it's not really that big a problem because we just unload the truck onto that into that store and they just sell the products over
They
time.
sell it.
And that's how we manage it.
Yeah.
And big deal. So
So
it wasn't worth, yeah, it wasn't worth solving for. So that's that you got to validate that it's worth solving for.
true.
Yeah.
So
Okay. So
the next
now
step in
what's
sort of in
so
continuing this, yeah. So is
yeah.
and this is one of my favorite things to talk about because it's actually a line that you taught me or that you called out once of something that I said. And whenever I say this now, I think of you. So you should, I think that's sort of funny. You should know that I think of you often when I'm
I've become
selling.
a memory that's burned in your head. Okay. All right.
Totally, totally.
That's good.
So we're at that point where we're leading the horse to water. We're getting them to admit that they have a problem that we can solve. Um, you don't want to lose that moment. This is gold, right? This is what you're working for. You want them to admit that they have a problem that you can solve. And when they do, you can't let them off the hook. So what I like to do, and what I do, I think about you all the time when I say this is I like to teach sales reps to pause. It's a dramatic effect.
Mhm.
They just told you that if they could do this, it would save them money and potentially increase their renewal rates. Pause. Be like, okay, let me tell you what I just heard. And that's the line. I love using that. Let me tell you what I just heard. What I just heard you say is boom, boom, boom. And now you are repeating it. Repetition is great, right? Repetition is king. You're making sure that everyone else now understands that that's important because maybe they were snoozing when the person said it first or not paying attention. And you're giving credence to the close that you're going to have later when you're going to use that again. Like, of course, this is going to make sense for us to continue onto a demo or into the next step because we can solve these problems for you. Correct? You've already told me that. So I think it's really important to do that. And additionally, all of this stuff here, when I talk about selling skills, all of these selling skills are really about getting information, getting them to admit, and then being able to use their language. So not to just be generic. So I think it's, like I said, really important to take notes and really important to listen to the language that they're using and try as often as possible to use it in the upcoming parts of the sales process next week, next month, next year, whenever it may be. So taking notes and remembering that stuff is super important. And again, it
Well,
goes back to the credibility
yeah.
factor of you getting credibility, gaining credibility.
Yeah, yeah. I appreciate that point about the pause. Let me just walk you through how I've used it, and I don't just use it to say afterwards what I heard you say. Is I use it all the time. I found that this pause, this dramatic pause, some people call it the pregnant pause because you're just waiting to hear what happens next. It should be used very judiciously, but it is extremely effective in making sure that all ears are tuned into what you're about to say next. And so
Yes.
you can use it just about any time. And I like that, you've gone through digging and digging through these layers of questions about getting them to admit their pain. And then once they've actually admitted the pain, you say the words, let me pause here for a moment. What I heard you say is, and that's the line. That line really helps you do a mini close on the spot because once they've admitted the pain and you are acknowledging that, and then they acknowledge that you totally understand it, now you've started to build a bit of a connection. And now the product sale, the solution that you have becomes so much easier because you're aligned. You're aligned with the problem that they have. I
Yep.
love it.
Totally.
So
And to your
Matt, at
point,
this
the
point,
dramatic effect is important.
yeah,
That's
yep.
super important. Um, I think one other thing to think about is it's also a way to regain control. Like if people start to lose a little bit of focus, doing things like pausing, doing things like calling specifically to call someone's name, like, hey, Raj, calling on them and
Hmm.
asking a specific question re-engages people too. So those are some selling skills as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. And it's important on the discovery call that you start the conversations, but then you cover your mouth because you got to stop talking because they've got to do the talking. And that's really what you want because you're discovering what's important to them, not trying to get them to discover that you're really important to them because that's backwards. Um, at this point, we're about 20 minutes, maybe even 25 minutes into the conversation. And if that's a 30-minute conversation, what are the next steps so that we can have that time at the end for the business discussion?
I'm glad you asked that because this is a skill and you need to work on this. And not everyone's comfortable doing this. But let's say that you do have that hard stop at the 30-minute mark. Okay. Let's say that, they said, yep, I have another call. And maybe you have a hard stop, which I think is important to tell them in the beginning when you set
Hmm.
the agenda. So let's say you're at the T-5 mark, okay, otherwise known as the 25-minute mark of the call. So you got 5 minutes left. Regardless of where you are in the discovery process, you have to stop and you have to call out and say, "Hey, listen, I feel like we're having a great conversation here. I've learned a ton. We have about 4 or 5 minutes left. I need to, we need to pause here and go over a couple of quick things. Um, and then you need to sort of take control and you need to determine what a great next step might be. So, first of all, if you are still in the middle of, discovery and you need to do more, then I would pause and confirm that the call's going as well as you think it does and say, let me tell you where we are so far. What I've heard is this, and this from you. It sounds like what we offer would be very beneficial. And then either, first of all, I'd get confirmation of that. I'd have them agree to that. And I'd actually ask them to expand on that and say, is there anything else, that you'd like to share? Any other learnings that you had that you'd like to share? Um, and I'd get them to, give you that answer. And I'd keep watching the clock, by the way, because you can't burn all of the 5 minutes. Um, and then you choose which direction. What is the next step? Do you need to continue discovery? Have you gotten enough discovery? And can you go to a demo if that's your next step in your process? Um, so you need to determine what that next step is and ask them if they think that, let's say that going to the demo is the next step. Get them to confirm, like I talked about, and validate. And if the demo is the next step, see if you can put it on the calendar, see if you can expand the audience. And by, again, doing that pre-call prep and asking some questions about their role in the organization will help understand who might need to be at that call. So ask specific, if specific people should attend the meeting. And if they're hesitant to put time on the calendar because they want to try to talk to other people, remember what you have to do. You have to go back and say, can we put 5 minutes on the calendar for you and I to plan the next step once you've talked to your people? Okay. So don't be afraid to do that. And don't be afraid to ask it twice. Like, if can we put some time on the calendar to do a demo? No, I'm not ready yet. I'll call you next week. How about we put some time, 5 minutes on the calendar next Tuesday so that we can connect? We're both busy. We both get scheduled up. Instead of us chasing one another, let's just put some time on. And again, 90% of the time they say yes.
And I remember you using that word. You want to avoid the chase.
Yes.
That's what you want to avoid. You want to
You
actually
want to
have a
avoid the
commitment
chase.
at the end. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, here's what happens.
Yeah.
It's not just the chase. I could tell you as a sales leader, getting those calendared next steps changes the whole dynamic of forecast calls. I despise I'm thinking about it now and I'm cringing. When I'm listening to a forecast call or running a forecast call and 50% of the deals that we're going over start with, well, Bob and I really need to connect. I owe Bob a call. I don't want to hear that. What I want to hear is, oh, we had a
Yeah.
meeting last week. They bought into these value propositions. They were very interested. We talked price. We seemed to be, in line. They didn't run. And they were going to go discuss with their team or their boss or the person who asked them to meet and try to get them into a demo. We're targeting the demo to be next week. And we have a call on Tuesday to schedule the demo. So we have a calendared event to schedule. What a better presentation by the sales rep to leadership. So for all of you sales reps out
Mhm.
there, if you want to have a better forecast call, get a calendar next step. Trust me.
Mhm, mhm, and I like that you touched on in terms of who is on the call, because you really wanna make sure that the people that you're talking to fit your buyer persona. So there's the ideal client profile, which is the kind of company you're going after, and then within that, if you're selling, that the to a multi-stakeholder environment where you've gotta get buy-in from 4 or 5, maybe even more different people, before they actually buy your solution, you need to know what those personas are and have those personas on those calls, because nobody, assistants or whatever, will be able to translate what you're saying as well as you can. So if you need to be talking to the COO or an executive VP, that's who you got to talk to. You can't talk to their assistants or the manager that's 2 levels below who's been assigned to filter all this stuff up. At some point, you need to unlayer that conversation so that you can get higher up. And sometimes I even use words like, "Hey, should we go ahead and schedule a call? Bring them into the call so that they can fully understand the depth all the options, and we can talk about other things that may be on their agenda as well. So there's ways to actually bring people into that call. Do you have other ideas about how you get the right people into that next call if you need to?
Um, well, so to recap a couple of things that I've sort of spruced in here intermittently, that's one of the reasons it's important to do some pre-call prep, to know who fits on the team, and that's another reason why it's important to understand whose role. I think you can also ask the person, especially if it's a smaller, more intimate crowd, who ultimately makes the decision on these? What's the decision-making process? These are all some things you can
Yeah.
ask at the end if you've left enough
That's one
time.
of my favorite questions. That is one of my favorite questions. What's the decision-making process in your company? And I think a lot of people get afraid to ask that too early, but I've always seen that when you ask it, people are just more than happy to share. Well, for us, it takes 6 months to buy a product like yours, or, "Oh, it's actually pretty quick, just a couple of weeks, we'll have a decision." Knowing that is gold.
Yes. It's really important, and here's another reason why it's important to ask that question. Many times they don't know the buying process or the decision-making
Mhm.
process, and it allows you to interject some thoughts, especially if this is sort of an unbudgeted thing that they're looking for, and they took a meeting by chance because it was interesting. So this is when you need to flip the and become a coach to them. Um, so you need to sort of start to help them understand. Well, typically, who's your boss? Who do you report into? What's their role? Do they have their own budget, or do they have to go, get budget from someone else? And those are questions that people are afraid to ask. The budget word is always a question that reps are afraid to ask, but it's a super important one. So I would
Yeah.
suggest asking it all the time, or not all the time, but in all situations when people don't share. So you need to become the coach and help them understand the process. So that's the other reason why it's important.
All right. And then, of course, you get that next steps on the calendar. And again, this was about the discovery call. This wasn't about signing on on the dotted line yet. This is the discovery call. There's multiple components to a sales process. And as part of our little sales boot camp here, Matt and I wanted to share the process that we found works very effectively. I'm going to just go down the list and recap all of these steps. And Matt, just chime in if you think there's something that I missed here. But first, the person doing the call should be someone senior enough to be able to handle a lot of depth in these conversations. And so, if you happen to be a BDR, a business development rep, or an SDR handling these calls, it's okay to let people know that you don't have all that information. You can certainly check, but that's one of the reasons you want to get on the call and to help set up the meeting. So, step zero. Do your prep work. Step one, transition from the small talk into something like what prompted you to take this call. Step two, set the agenda. If you need to verify that this isn't a demo, that's fine, but just set the agenda and then do a time check so that you know when your hard stop is. Step three is to verify their strategic initiatives, maybe a 2-minute discussion to make sure that you're on the same page. Step four, that's your 2-minute pitch that's going into three different things: the problem that you solve for, how you solve it, and what the benefits are of solving it. And then we go into other things
Hey,
like
Raj,
unlayering. Yep.
can I make a quick comment about the
Yeah.
pitch? And it's something you and I
Yeah.
have talked about in the past, and I didn't mention it today. You mentioned 2 minutes on strategic initiatives. The pitch should be it should not be long. The pitch should be,
Yeah.
2 minutes. The longer it is, the more confusing it is, and again, in Aunt Betty-like fashion, you wanna make it pretty self-explanatory, so or pretty
Hmm.
easily to understand. So, I would not go into a
That's right.
5-10 minute diatribe about your product, and if
Yeah.
if that's the only way you can do it, you gotta change it up in practice. So, sorry to
You
take you
gotta
off
tighten
track,
it.
but
Go. Yeah, no, that's actually a great point. You could go to ChatGPT to help you tighten the words if that's what you need to do, but
yeah.
tighten the words, get it down a little bit shorter. And then in terms of that, what that pitch is, you're trying to get the client or the prospect to describe their pain and get them to basically admit their pain points so that you can say, let me pause here for a moment. What I heard you say is, and then
Mhm.
verify that that is indeed the pain point, and then start to use that to help connect the dots. So that's step six is pausing to recognize the pain. Step seven is you transition to that business discussion, do a time check. And step eight, and you cannot leave the conversation without step eight, and that is to get a calendared item as your next step.
even if it's something as simple as a
And
check-in
there you have
call
it.
to get the next step scheduled. And that's what 90% or maybe 70% of them usually turn out to be. But
Yeah.
please, yeah, if you take nothing away from this call but one thing, take that. Like it's and everyone can do it. You don't have to be a great superstar salesperson. It will change your close rates, the amount of time you have, because and is, like I said, will lead to higher close rates because you'll have more follow-ups. So please.
And one of the best times of the year, I love to use this is Q4 when you get a lot of people saying, "Oh, we're not going to focus on this right now. We're too busy closing out the year. Let's talk in January or let's talk sometime next year." And so you can use that as an opportunity to schedule a time in January. Say, "I totally understand that if they're not going to close, I mean, if you absolutely know they're not going to close, then go ahead and set up a time. Hey, how about we book a time on the calendar, second week of January right now so that when we're back from the holidays, we can actually have this conversation. And more than likely, you'll get that. And the cool thing is, you come back from the holidays and your calendar is already full, ready to go with phone calls. So there you have it. Matt, thank you so much for your insights. I love the flow. I love the process. It's a straightforward 8-step process. We're going to have a description of it in the description of this podcast
Awesome.
below. And you can reach out to Matt at, how do people get a hold of you if they need some additional sales training, Matt?
Uh, on LinkedIn, Matt Melnick. My email is mattmelnick23@gmail.com. And my cell is 301-346-2100. And I'm sorry, I got to add one thing to the business process. I just gave you my cell phone number. Um, what COVID and working from home has allowed us to do is to be a little bit uh, more able to ask people for their cell phone number as part of that 5 minutes at the end. I would ask people for their cell phone number, especially if they tell you they work from home, and tell them that it's really efficient to text and, get quick conversations, and you probably get them 50% of the time. So sorry, had to throw
You
that in
know,
there, but I
I
forgot, and I think it's great.
That's cool that you did that. There's a very active person on social media called Gary Vaynerchuk. Many people have heard of him, follow him. I think he's fantastic, and he actually gives out his cell phone number. And this guy's followed by millions of people. I can't even imagine the amount of texts he gets from people
Yeah,
who are either
that's
trying to
funny.
pitch him, but he openly shares that, and because he wants to connect, with people. Because
Yeah,
at the end, you're not selling to a machine, you're not selling to a company, you're selling to a human being.
and
And
as a way to
so,
soften it,
very
you can
good.
say to someone, "Hey, I won't overuse it. I'll use email as the primary, but, if we need to get a hold of each other, this is a really, good and efficient way."
Excellent. Matt, thank you for joining me today. I hope everybody
Loved
listening
it.
got a
Loved
lot
it.
out of this conversation and knows how to do a discovery call that will help you close more sales. Thank you. See
Thanks,
you next
Raj.
time.
Love the chat.